Let's get rolling on a Thursday. Glasses in session. We go to the Glasser guest line. Check in with Dylan Sinn, who joins us. Give him a follow on X at Dylan Sinn. Does a great job for the Journal Gazette. Dylan, it must have been an awesome year covering Indiana last year. You cover Indiana, Notre Dame, and Purdue, so you had two playoff teams, which must have been awesome. But certainly Indiana, an incredible story. Cignetti, that mania just sweeping the nation and kind of everybody falling in love with that story. What's it been this offseason heading into year two, right? Because it feels like Indiana's not going to be sneaking up on anybody this year. Do they feel like there's still an underdog role that they're thriving on, or are they kind of embracing now that everybody knows that they're here to stay and kind of taking that challenge?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because they did obviously have the greatest season in program history last year. You go 11-2, but they didn't feel like they ended the season the way they wanted to, right? Like, they started 10-0, and they had two chances against Ohio State and Notre Dame to really make their mark in the way they wanted to, and they didn't play as well as they wanted to in either of those games. And they've been very upfront about they had a great season and they did more than anyone expected, but they also left what they felt was a fair amount on the table. And so they have a lot of guys coming back this year. I think that's the thing that a lot of people haven't really realized is IU brings a fair amount of last year's team back, even before we get to the transfers they brought in. So they are motivated to go out there and do it again, because I do think a lot of people are kind of saying, well, it was a one-year wonder. Of course, they're not going to do it again. They can't do it again. So there's still plenty of that underdog mentality in this program. Kurt Cignetti is making sure of that. And they're going to come into the season with that chip on their shoulder again in the same way they did last year. The schedule is more difficult, I think, but it's still going to be one of those things where they have a chance to do some damage here.
They're going to have a new quarterback, a veteran quarterback coming over from the University of Cal, and Fernando Mendoza. What have been the impressions of him so far up to this point, Dylan?
Yeah, they like him a lot. I think number one, they like him as a leader. I think that was something that really stood out at Cal and has kind of transferred over to IU. Was he is a guy who the locker room is going to rally around. And so you needed that because Curtis Rourke, who was their quarterback last year, was that guy as well in spades. But to bring him in and kind of be able to make sure there's no kind of drop off at that position was huge. I think that one thing they really like about him is his mobility. Curtis Rourke last year obviously played the entire season with a torn ACL, which we learned about after the year. Real warrior stuff that he was able to do that, but it really limited his mobility and what they were able to do with like moving the pocket and getting him in space and things like that. Mendoza has that kind of mobility. Now, at Cal, sometimes it was a little bit more of a detriment because they didn't have a great offensive line, and he would run himself into some sacks. I think that's the number one thing you're looking for this year is with a better offensive line, which IU's is and should be better than last year and better than Cal. Can they do some creative things with Mendoza, get him moving in the pocket, get him to extend plays and see if you can make some plays out of structure. I think he's shown so far since he's gotten there that he has the ability to do that in addition to what we all know is a big arm. So they really like what they have there. They think he was one of the best quarterbacks, not the best quarterback in the portal this offseason, and they feel like they can win a lot of games with him behind center.
On the other side of the ball, the defense was terrific for Indiana last year, had a bunch of sacks. They were awesome against the run, just a really technically sound group. They do lose some guys, but also bringing back some key pieces from last year's defense. What do you expect that unit to look like this year?
Yeah, I think it's going to be really good. I think there are very few teams in the country that have an All-American returning on the defensive line, at linebacker, and in the secondary. So all three levels of the defense, IU has an All-American from last year coming back with Mikhail Kamara on the defensive line, with Aiden Fisher, a linebacker, and then with D'Angelo Pons, a corner, whom a lot of people consider one of the best corners in the country. I certainly do. I think he is really, really talented. So that is a fantastic foundation upon which to build. You're right. They did lose some pieces. CJ West, the defensive tackle, both the defensive tackles, frankly, with James Carpenter going as well. That's going to be tough to replace. They brought in some good transfers to that position. It's just a question of can those guys stand up to some of the better offensive lines in the Big Ten, which Indiana is going to face this year. So the defense has a great foundation. It brings back the coordinator and Bryant Haynes, who I thought was fantastic last season. Keeping him was a huge, huge deal when he had opportunities to go elsewhere. So I think the defense is going to be really good. It's just a question of, I think, along the defensive line, in the interior especially, do some of those transfers that they brought in, who have talent, who were coveted in the portal, do they hit?
What's your area of concern for the Indiana team? You mentioned maybe the depth a little bit on the defensive line. Would you say it's that? Is there another area that maybe concerns you heading into the season?
Yeah, I think it is that defensive tackle spot. And they did a good job bringing in guys who on paper are really good. Jose Wheeler is a good pickup for them at defensive tackle, all conference USA guy. But it's just a question of whether you're going to be able to hold up in the middle there. Getting CJ West for them last year was so huge. As a late portal addition, beating out LSU for him, and then he went out there and wrecked shot most of the season and is in the NFL now. So getting that kind of production in the middle really freed up their linebackers to do a lot of different things and blitz and play free. That's why Jalen Walker and Aiden Fisher were as good as they are, I think, and despite the fact that they're talented players in their own right. So if I had to pick an area of concern for this team, it's defensive tackle. But it's hard to say that's a concern because they did address it in the offseason. And I think that's what's most impressive to me about what Indiana did this offseason was any area you could pick out and say, well, I don't know about that one. Well, that looks like a concern. They went out and got a really high-level transfer to fill that spot, right? And so I do think that they have a really well-rounded roster. There's not a position where you look at, boy, that's a real red flag there. It's just a question of whether some of these guys who have played good football elsewhere are going to play good football for IU.
We're talking with Dylan Sinn here, the Journal Gazette. Give Dylan a follow on X at Dylan Sinn. And Dylan, I think a lot of people, program like Indiana, you have that dream season like they did, 11-0, you go to the college football playoff. They probably expect some regression this year, right? In Indiana, maybe they go 7-5, maybe they go 8-4, something like that. This is obviously the test of the great programs and maybe just the programs that are good and have great seasons every 5 years, every 10 years. What do you expect out of Indiana this upcoming season? Do you think what Cignetti is building is sustainable? Obviously, in a really difficult conference, do you expect there to be some regression this season? What are you kind of expecting out of Indiana?
Yeah, the way I've kind of been describing it to people is I have no idea if their record is going to be as good as it was last year, just because that was it was one of those things where just everything came together, right? They played a relatively soft schedule. Michigan was down on top of that, and then they started out 10-0, and it was kind of magic, right? I think the talent level for this year's team is actually higher than it was last year. I think this is a more talented team to me on paper than it was last season. Now, is their record going to be as good? I don't know. Like they could have regression in record while being a better team overall, just because they're playing a more difficult schedule. They got some more difficult opponents in the Big Ten this year. They're almost certainly going to start 3-0. It's three relatively insignificant non-conference opponents, and then you get right into the meat of the Big Ten schedule. You get Illinois, Iowa, Oregon back to back to back. Iowa on the road at Kinnick. I think that the game to circle for Indiana is that game against Illinois, the Big Ten opener. There's been a lot of discussion in the offseason about how can Illinois be this year's Indiana, which I think is silly because Illinois went 10-3 last year and IU was 3-9 2 years ago. But it is one of those things where Illinois is trying to be that upstart program from the Big Ten that breaks into the upper levels of the conference this year and steals a playoff spot, right? But you're getting them at home. Can you, if you go out there and win that game, suddenly you're 4-0 with a win over a team that's almost certainly going to be in the top 25 at that point. Now you're cooking, right? Now you feel like, okay, this is maybe there for us again where we can make another run. So circle that game. It's going to be a great game between two teams that are really trying to crash the party again. Should be a lot of fun.
Certainly will be. Vegas, they have their win total, Dylan, at 8.5. Indiana's, the over is plus 110. So it feels like odds makers expecting an 8-4 season out of Indiana. I think it's totally fair. You said you don't know record-wise what to expect out of Indiana. If you had to make a guess, what do you think the Hoosiers finish this season? What do you think their record ends up being?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a cop-out, but I think I'm going to go 8-4. I think that that would feel like a disappointment to some IU fans, but I don't think it would be. I think 8-4 against this schedule for a team that 2 years ago was 3-9 is still really, really impressive. And so I think that you win most of the games you should win. Maybe you steal one that you weren't supposed to, and you end up 9-3. But I think 8-4 is probably where this team settles up, and you feel like, hey, 2 years in, Curt Cignetti has had a real nice run here to start his tenure.
No doubt about it. Great stuff. Dylan Sinn. Check him out. Journal Gazette. Give him a follow on X at Dylan Sinn. Joining us here on Send It In. Dylan, really appreciate the time, man. Hope to catch up with you during the season. And have a great rest of your summer. Thanks again for hopping on.
Absolutely, guys. Thanks for having me on. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem at all. Great stuff there from Dylan Sinn as we keep it rolling here on Send It In. talking a little Indiana football, and you can see right there on the screen as Sean pops up the schedule. Again, that was really one of the big storylines with Indiana last year during that incredible season. They did have a soft schedule, didn't have to play Penn State, didn't have to play Oregon. Michigan had a down year, and then, of course, they ended up playing Ohio State late in the year, ended up losing that game. But this year, you can see schedule a little bit more difficult for Indiana, as Dylan was mentioning. How about those 3 road games that they have at Iowa, at Oregon, and then at Penn State? That's not going to be easy. Also, that Big Ten home opener against Illinois. And you could have some tricky games along the way, because, again, what's going to be one of the biggest challenges for Indiana this upcoming season is the fact that they were so great last year. Cignetti did such a great job. They're not going to catch anybody sleeping this upcoming season. So that'll be something for Indiana to navigate for the upcoming year. As far as the roster goes, I mean, Dylan said they might be even more talented this year than they were last year. I don't think that's a crazy take. I kind of agree with them. I mean, you heard him say on defense, they have an All-American on all 3 levels, right? D-line, linebacking core, and in the secondary. That's really good. Mendoza comes over from Cal. I always liked him as a quarterback. Think he's going to be solid. How about Roman Hemby comes over from Maryland as their new running back? He's going to be terrific. And then they're going to have one of the best receivers in the Big Ten, guy who was second team Big Ten last year in Elijah Surratt. So, again, like Indiana, both sides of the ball, right? Kind of all 3 levels, quarterback, running back, wide receiver on offense, all 3 levels on defense. And then offensive line is going to be solid. They're going to be experienced. They're going to have a really good team. And what you got to love about Indiana is they're going to be well coached. They're not going to beat themselves. They were so great last year in winning the turnover battle. They were so great in being disciplined and not committing penalties. Now, you would expect them not to be as great in those categories this season, but still going to be really good. And, I mean, how good is Coach Cignetti? Guy's had 14 years as a head coach, and he's had a winning record all 14 seasons in the college level. Guy's been really, really good. So we know Cignetti's the real deal. Obviously not expecting Indiana to do what they did last year. Their win total at BetMGM is a reflection of that, with the win total being 8.5 and the over being at plus 110. I really think that is a perfect number at 8.5, right? I mean, the 3 road games for Indiana are going to be tough to win. They're going to be big underdogs to Penn State. It's going to be tough to win that game. They're going to be underdogs to Iowa. We know Kinnick is always a difficult place to play. The Oregon game, I think, is interesting. I don't know if Indiana's going to win at Oregon. Autzon's always a tough place to play. But they are coming off of a bye. They're going to have 2 weeks to prep. And Cignetti, throughout his entire career as a coach, has been so good off of a bye week. So that could be one of those games where Indiana, off of a bye, gets a fast start as an underdog. You make that a fourth quarter game in Eugene. You never know what happens. So maybe that game could be interesting. I'd still pick Oregon to win the game. You get 3 losses there. And then it just feels like it's going to come down to all the home games. Is Indiana going to go undefeated in their home games in the Big Ten schedule? If they do that, then you got to feel good about the Hoosiers going over 8.5 wins. I think it's a perfect line, though. I'm staying away. Interested to see how Indiana is for the upcoming season. We're getting ready to talk about the Commanders, who, I mean, we're kind of the Indiana version of the NFL. These teams are so hard to handicap because Indiana's not one of the big brands, one of the premier teams in college football year after year, the Alabamas, Ohio States, Georgias, where these teams just reload year after year. Indiana, they could be the TCU from a couple years ago, that TCU team that goes all the way to the national title and then kind of falls back down. They could be that Auburn team with Cam Newton, wins the national title, then kind of falls back down. You know, I don't think we all expect Indiana to be one of the top programs in the Big Ten year after year. They're just not going to get the recruits that Ohio State, that Michigan, Oregon, Penn State are going to get. But I think they're going to be a really solid program. They kind of could be what Iowa is every single year in the Big Ten. We always know what we're going to get out of Kirk Ferentz's teams every single year. I kind of think Indiana could be another version of that. So I'm afraid to bet against Cignetti. I'm afraid to fade him and bet the under on Indiana. I just wouldn't bet the over, though. I think 8.5 is a perfect line. So I'm going to stay away from Indiana's win total as well.